Hey everyone, we're here to tell you about the Venture Maidens podcast.
For lifelong gamers.
For longtime friends.
Doing a real play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons podcast.
Including such themes as...
Ooh, awkward NPC romance.
Darts to the butt.
Chopping things with axes.
Find us on iTunes, Spreaker, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch.
New episodes every other Sunday.
Or every other Wednesday on Twitch.
Check out our website, www.theventuremaidens.com.
And start the quest today. Until then, venture away.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I am talking with game designer Craig Campbell, and I'm talking to Shane and I-Hsien from the Total Party Thrill podcast. I am so excited to talk with these people about some non-D&D games. We've had a lot of requests for games that are non-D&D. What should we play? Where do we start? Where do we go? Craig had this great idea about us talking about games in different sort of independent genres. You know, games from the OSR, games that are made by one person, games that have no GM. I do want to start off by saying that we talked about the OSR for a little bit, and I think we actually got it wrong after talking with some people in that community. We actually misrepresented it because none of us are big OSR guys. Thanks to Greg Blair for helping me correct that mistake. I do want to say that because I want to be educated on it, I'm going to do a podcast about the OSR at some point in the near future. My friend Greg Blair will come on because he's an expert, and we'll see who else from that community we can get to come talk with us. So shout it out. Let me know if there's someone from the OSR you'd like to hear on this podcast. But without further ado, let's get to Craig, Shane, and I-Hsien. Roll it. Okay, everybody, I am here with an amazing panel of RPG aficionados, designers, podcasters, and amazing people. Why don't we go around the table and tell everybody out there who you are and what you do in the world of tabletop RPGs. And let's start with you, Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig Campbell. I've been playing games for like 2.5 decades. I've freelanced a bunch for Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder and some other games. A few years ago, I started designing on my own. I published a game called Murders and Acquisitions late last year. It's available at DriveThruRPG. And I also podcast. It's a geeky podcast, not strictly gaming, but a little bit of everything. So I've got my fingers in all of what you just talked about, James.
Excellent. And, of course, we have two people who are no stranger to me because they've been on my old podcast, The Roundtable, and now here they are talking about RPGs. We've got two people from the Total Party Thrill podcast. Shane, why don't you tell people who you are in this wild world of tabletop role-playing games?
I'm Shane. I am one of the hosts of the Total Party Thrill podcast, which covers RPGs and Eberron and stuff that I-Hsien and I like now mostly, and some D&D 5e as well. And I am hardly as accomplished as Craig, but I did manage to publish 4 whole pages of a game on DriveThruRPG once. So there's that.
It's a great game.
It's a game. It's a NASCAR-inspired micro RPG based loosely on Fiasco. So if that really gets your engines revving, then check it out. Boom! That's that pun. But yeah, it's part of a compilation actually, and we wrote it for charity. It's called 2 Weeks. TWO Weeks.
Oh, nice. And is that how much time you had to write the RPG?
It is, though I actually wrote it on a train ride. So,
wow.
There's that. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. That's my theme.
Nice. And, of course, the other half of the Total Party Thrill podcast, the guy who is updating the Instagram account, it is I-Hsien. Welcome.
Hey, yeah, I'm I-Hsien. I am the other co-host of Total Party Thrill. It pains me to say it, but I'm actually less accomplished than even Shane because I have not created a mediocre RPG and placed it online. So, but I guess I'll get on that, I suppose.
Clock's ticking.
Like Craig, I've been playing games for too many decades. I don't like to think about it because it means I'm old. But I think, we're going to be talking about some old games today, which is kind of great.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely we're going to talk about some old games. And that's a perfect chance for us to get into the meat of the topic. Craig, you brought this to me, and it's essentially, right, we're talking about all different kinds of RPGs out there. Huge games, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, to lesser played but still well-supported games. We're talking about Star Wars, Fate, GURPS, and then we've got indie games, and we've got micro RPGs, and we've got free-to-play games, and there's the OSR, and we've got hacks, we've got all these things. So with such a diverse market and such a small consumer base, we're going to talk about some best games in each sort of category so that our listeners can get to know some stuff. I, like many of you, started out with Dungeons and Dragons because it's the big bad boy out there. So let's talk about the games that are big in the world of tabletop role-playing games but aren't called Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder. I'm talking about games from Fantasy Flight, Green Ronin, Pelgrane Press, that sort of thing. What are your favorite, I don't want to call them second tier because that makes it sound like the quality is not there, but your favorite games made by a big publisher who isn't Wizards of the Coast or Paizo. And Craig, let's start with you. Give me a few of your favorite games in that category.
Well, I have one in particular that came to mind when we started looking at all of these because I didn't want to overload. But Monty Cook Games puts out a bunch of games, and the one that really struck my fancy, and I got a chance to play it a couple of years ago, and I want to play it more, but I can't find a stinking group, is The Strange.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Cypher system. I imagine you guys are.
Yeah.
But it's the system is pretty straightforward. It crosses over Numenera and The Strange, and basically every game that they're doing over there, I think. And it's predicated on the idea of you are playing a blank blank who blanks.
Right.
So an adjective, noun who does something, who verbs. And then it just, the system builds out from there depending upon the game in question. And the thing that I really dug about The Strange was it allows your characters to jump from world to world. And when you jump from world to world, you act like part of your character sheet remains the same, but then you flip over this template of stuff that's like, this is the information about your character when you're in this other world where things about you change. And, I like the idea of like a character that morphs a little bit that maybe isn't always just the same set of rules. But it's not so overwhelming that it's like playing a brand new character. You're not suddenly just changing characters. You're just kind of like, I'm going to take these 5 things about my character and they're going to be different. So I dug that game.
Yeah, I love The Strange for that very reason. It's so many settings within one game, which is kind of cool. And I think that's a great idea. How about you, Shane? What's one of your favorites from a big company that isn't Wizards of the Coast or Paizo?
So I'll take the Fantasy Flight Star Wars, specifically Edge of the Empire, because I think that is the one that's easiest to reskin and recast in other settings. But I love the dice system for that and the sort of varying degrees of resolution and how that really promotes kind of cinematic scenes in your games. I'm one of those weird people who took a break from gaming when I was in college. And so when I came back to gaming, I was so tired and unenthusiastic about like the procedural dungeon crawl that I just wanted cinema. Like I wanted things to be exciting and over the top, and like I wanted everybody to be, engaged and cheering and, having fun and picturing this movie in their mind. And I feel like Edge of the Empire does a great job of giving the players the flexibility to create those moments. And I like it so much that I went back and bought Warhammer Fantasy because it's based on like the similar dice system, but like, a little bit less refined and a lot more deadly. So that's how much I like the system.
I should say that I am not familiar with Warhammer Fantasy, but I want to get to know it better because I've been listening to the Total Party Thrill podcast where you guys are recapping your Warhammer Fantasy game, which is pretty exciting. I really love the dice system from Fantasy Flight Games for Star Wars. People should definitely check that out. How about you, I-Hsien? What's a favorite game from a big publisher that isn't Wizards of the Coast or Paizo?
Well, I knew being on a show about favorites with Shane, I sort of needed to have backups. So since he took Edge of the Empire, which I agree with, I'm going with a 40K game, Dark Heresy 2nd Edition by Fantasy Flight Games. It sort of killed us when they lost the license, so there aren't going to be any more books coming out, but I guess on the bright side, that means that it's a complete package now. You have everything that you're going to get.
Yeah,
You
it's
don't
only
need to
4
worry
books.
about power creep. Yeah, done.
Whole system, 4 books.
I will say, like, is it the most amazing or balanced system? No, but that's 40K, right? Like, the world is out to screw you, and sometimes the dice or the rules in this game are too. So it fits really well, I think.
And I guess I should correct myself. Shane, when you were talking about Warhammer, did you mean 40K, or were you talking about a different form of Warhammer?
No, Warhammer Fantasy 3rd edition is completely separate. Actually, it's weird. So the Warhammer 40K RPGs are based on Warhammer Fantasy 2nd edition, which was a Green Ronin product.
And also an excellent game in its own right.
And a good game, yeah. That Fantasy Flight bought the rights to. And then when they made Rogue Trader and the 40K line of games, they adapted that 2nd edition. Then they moved on for the 3rd edition into the kind of cinema dice that ended up becoming the Star Wars games. So it's kind of a cool little bloodline there.
Yeah, well, I'll need to make sure I edit myself to make myself sound smart. But
yeah, and we're recapping our Rogue Trader game,
which is a 40K game, right?
Correct. Yep.
From here on out, we're sort of moving into smaller and smaller games. So just before we do that, this is kind of breaking the rules a little bit, but I want to just give a shout out to a Wizards of the Coast game that's done with Star Wars Saga Edition, which was like a precursor to 4E. It's like a D20 game. It's done, right? It's complete. Nothing else is coming out for it, but there's an amazing and really active fan community that has created like digital tools. So it's not like doing your taxes anymore. You know, like the Excel spreadsheet takes care of it. And it's really nicely balanced. I know there are a bunch of Star Wars games out there, but it's almost like a solved game. So like if you are a GM who's sort of worried about things getting crazy, like go to forums and people will tell you exactly what not to do.
That's awesome.
Also, it's great if you want square books on your shelf.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned, right? Rodney Thompson, who worked on that game, then went on to be one of the developers of 5th edition D&D. And he's doing some stuff now that maybe we'll talk about later. And I just want to give a shout out to Night's Black Agents, which is a gumshoe game. It's sort of like Super Spies versus Vampires from Pelgrane Press. It's got an awesome campaign. It's this open campaign called The Dracula Dossier, won a bunch of Ennies, where essentially you are hunting down Dracula, who has become active again with all of these ex-awesome super spies who now fight vampires and ghouls and all kinds of things. I think it helps contribute to that cinematic feel you were talking about, Shane. You know, I get tired of the dungeon crawl too, and Night's Black Agents has you hopping all over the freaking globe to fight vampires and punch Dracula in the face with your silver brass knuckles and things like that. So I'm a big fan, and I think the system, Gumshoe, does a great job of sort of cinematically portraying these different action events. And one of the things that's cool about Gumshoe is the system is sort of built on the idea that it's not fun to investigate things poorly. So you have a set of investigative skills that allow you to find clues immediately as long as you're using them in the way that they're sort of meant to be used. You know, there's no chance of failure as long as you go. If you're looking for footprints and there are footprints there, you'll find them. You know, you won't have to roll and not find them, and then the GM has to come up with some other way for you to get you on the right trail. It's just there, and you make it happen, which I think is really cool. So Night's Black Agents, check that out. Ken Hite did an awesome job with that.
I like that game because you ended up learning the whole setting in history class.
Right.
So you don't even really need to do a whole lot of ramping up.
Yeah.
It's just set in the real world.
Yeah, it's amazing. With all of its problems and boils and things like that. You can tell that Ken Hite loves him some history. So why don't we move on? I-Hsien, you had mentioned that sort of the scope shrinks down with each category. So why don't we go to you so that Shane doesn't steal all of yours? What's your favorite indie game from a small company that doesn't have as much support as like a Fantasy Flight Games or a Pelgrane Press or a Green Ronin, you know, but bigger maybe than a 1 or 2 man shop?
Yeah, I think they don't feel necessarily small because there's so much support, but Posthuman Studios and Eclipse Phase is absolutely one of my favorite games. Actually, I think if someone approached me and said, let's play an RPG, you pick the RPG, 9 times out of 10 it would be Eclipse Phase.
But that's because you can't find a group.
Yes, that's also true. No one wants to play it because there's so much math and paperwork. But I absolutely love the setting, and to be perfectly honest, like it's where I think we're going to be in 50 to 500 years in the real world. So, you know.
It should be mentioned, this is a horror game, right?
Horror, existential crises. It's set in the quote unquote near future where like the singularity has occurred and like AI has completely like nearly wiped out the human race, and we jump bodies and, you know, fork our consciousness and erase personalities, and psychosurgery means you have no idea like what's real and what's not. And it's a bit like the Matrix, but like far worse.
So like the Matrix Revolutions?
Yeah, but like no like sweaty dance parties in Zion.
Oh, that's the only good part of that movie. Anyway.
Everyone's a creepy twin.
So this is what you think we might be like in the near future? Like, terrible?
I think it's quite possible. Yeah, the singularity's coming. Just who knows when. I like to sit around sometimes thinking, I or my children might be the last generation that dies. That sucks.
Craig, how about you? What's one of your favorite indie games that doesn't have as much support as a bigger game?
Well, this might be cheating a little bit and starting to bleed into the tiny indie game segment that's coming up. But something that I've been trying to check out more of lately is the Apocalypse World games, just the breadth of them. The games that are built around the Powered by the Apocalypse game engine, which is originally by
Vincent Baker.
There you go. I mean, I've just taken a step back from playing D&D so much. And, you know, just a little secret here. This whole podcast is me tricking you guys into telling me what other types of games I should play. And so one of the things that I have found is, the Apocalypse World stuff I've had a chance to play a little bit. We'll be playing a little bit more soon. I love the versatility of the system and how it still maintains a dice mechanic, but it's not about, you deal this much damage or you jump this far. It's more about defining a narrative. Every result on the die on your dice rolls is built into narrative focus. And it's so easily reskinnable into such a wide variety of different types of games. And in fact, it encourages that just by its narrative structure. So I'm really digging it in general. I'm going to be playing Epillion a little bit later this month, which is a game that uses Powered by the Apocalypse, and you play dragons. And that's all I know about it, and I'm looking forward to it.
It's pretty cool that you mentioned, you like this system where it pushes the story forward rather than, a lot of math, which I think was a theme we sort of heard with Shane and when he was talking about the Star Wars Fantasy Flight game, which is interesting. So that brings me to you, Shane. What is one of your favorite games in this category?
It's a theme I'm going to double down on. I'm not sure if this is quite a large enough company to qualify for this category, but I'm going to go with Phoenix Dawn Command,
yes,
which is by Keith Baker and his company, Together Studios. It's a small team that worked on it, and it's a pretty small game. There's just the core set, but it's all card-based. So your character sheet is a set of cards. So it's kind of a deck-building mechanic as you level up. And then all resolution is based on playing cards from your hand. So you manipulate the number of cards you can play or the number of cards in your hand and how you redraw and what goes into your discard pile and those types of things in order to accomplish things in the game. And then because it's a Keith Baker game, like the setting is just this incredible kind of post, sort of Roman fantasy kind of thing mixed with humans reborn with magical powers to become phoenixes, I guess, and also some kind of existential horror with the zombie / Cthulhuid monster with the chant. So it's a cool setting, and I like the way that the mechanics interact. My theme here is clearly that I like mechanics that aren't D&D in my non-D&D games.
I just played that for the first time this weekend. I backed it. I've had the rule book, and I've been so eager to play, and it delivered. It's a great game, and would definitely be on my list for this category as well. I think Keith Baker is one of my favorite designers. I love Eberron, Gloom is a really great game. So I think he knows how to create mechanics that can tell a great story too. So it's super, super cool that you picked that one. And I'm not surprised since it won a Thrilly this year. Right? Is that right?
It did. One of the least prestigious awards in the industry, yes.
I feel like that's a low bar, the least prestigious awards. Or a high bar? I'm not really sure. I guess I'm not sure how that metaphor would work.
It's very prestigious. Please return our calls, Keith.
And I'm going to pick for this category Dusk City Outlaws. It's a game that I just kickstarted. Rodney Thompson, who worked on the aforementioned Saga edition, put out that game on Kickstarter. If you back the Kickstarter, you've got early access to the playtest materials, and it is just super fun. It's everything I've ever wanted in a heist game, and he's got a lot of support, a lot of people working on it, although it sounds like he's pretty much the driving force behind it. Really great art, really evocative, really fun, and it's made for the nights when your entire game group can't make it, but you still want to play an RPG. So it's super easy to create characters, comes with a bunch of prepared scenarios that are really easy to read over, and then you make this really cinematic game that is super simple to play, and it's like set in a Renaissance with magic period Florence, but if Florence were as big as New York City is today, with just as many people and just as large. It's a really cool idea for a game, and a lot of fun to play with your friends. You can actually check us out playing it on the Don't Split the Podcast Twitch stream, if people want to get a look of what that game is. So let's move even smaller. Let's zoom in some more, and we'll talk about 1 or 2 person game shops. What do people like? And Shane, let's start with you.
I don't know, again, how this quite fits categorically, but shout out for Shadow of the Demon Lord?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's maybe more of an OSR game even, but and it's maybe even a little bit bigger than Phoenix Dawn Command, so I don't know. It's
a one-man shop.
But, it is. So it's by Rob Schwab, who has his name attached to just about every project you've ever seen, and a whole lot of his friends have contributed to it. So there's like 1 million adventures available for it, a number of supplements that they've written. So it's very much like a grim, dark fantasy. It definitely evokes the Warhammer Fantasy feeling in the world, but it is just a very simplified and streamlined kind of D20 system that's, I don't know, it's a lot of fun to play and results in lots of dead characters. So maybe it's more OSR than I thought.
Yeah, and it is a lot of fun to play. It's a lot of fun to build characters too. It feels like it satisfies all sorts of players. Your min-maxers can get in there with the infinite sort of combinations with the number of classes that there are, and it's super easy to pick up and play, so it satisfies people who just want to tell a really grim, dark, with a little bit of comedy mixed in their story. So super, super fun. How about you, Craig? What is one of your favorite games from this category? And I don't know if you can say yourself or not. So if you want to say Murders and Acquisitions, go ahead.
We'll plug it at the end. Quick note on Rob Schwab and Shadow of the Demon Lord. It's also fun for GMs simply because of the versatility and the quickness of kind of like the way the adventures are set up. There's not these giant long adventures. And also he remarked about something about a demon that's made entirely of running chainsaws, which scares the bejesus out of me. So anyway, check that out, I guess. But I've got something right now, like the tiny 1 and 2 person shop indie games are like my wheelhouse because I've been heavy into checking out little shops like mine doing games on Kickstarter. And so there's one that's in the final days of fulfillment. They should be publishing by about May or so of this year, and then it'll be available in some form or another, I'm sure. It's called Threadbare, and it's by Stephanie Bryant. And she describes it as a stitch punk RPG set in a broken world populated by broken toys. So think like, a dilapidated teddy bear and a broken doll, and a little, toy dump truck with eyes where only one of the eyes works. Those are your characters. and you're running around this broken world, and it's mostly about kind of developing relationships and trying to fix your world. In fact, I don't believe there's actually any rules for combat in the game, or maybe there's an alternate set of rules for combat. When you do get damaged, if something happens to you, you get repaired, and that might change the description of your character, and even sometimes your character's personality, as like, you morph based on, losing a piece of yourself, literally, or having your fur set on fire or whatever. So I'm intrigued by the idea, and I've looked through the beta rules a little bit, which were pretty preliminary, but it's coming soon, so keep an eye out.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep an eye out for that. How about you, I-Hsien? What are some of your favorite, or one of your favorite, 1- and 2-man shop games?
Well, I'll just say that Threadbare sounds more terrifying than existential horror to me. So
someone had a rough childhood,
right?
Red Coraline button eyes. I'm not quite sure if this fits in the category because I'm not quite sure exactly who's involved anymore. But I'm going to say Blades in the Dark. It seems like it's basically just John Harper. It may be more attached to Evil Hat at this point, but it's relatively small in terms of the way that it plays. It's essentially like a heist thieves guild type game where everyone plays a different member of the guild, but at the same time, the guild itself is like a character. So you can sort of apply XP that you gain to guild abilities that everyone can benefit from, but then you also level up your individual characters. And the whole point is to sort of like almost like an Ocean's 11 or like a Usual Suspects type caper where you're like trying to pull a job, and you can pull a series of jobs, which are the adventures. And I find that so much fun, and the mechanics themselves are just so different from what you get from a more traditional RPG.
That sounds really fun. I have not played that, and I want to check it out. And you guys are also giving me a lot of great ideas. This is super awesome. Hey, everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to let you know about our sponsor, Audible.com. Audible is an amazing audiobook service that is giving you, the listeners of Tabletop Babble, a free 30-day trial and free audiobook when you go to audibletrial.com/DSPN. That's audibletrial.com/DSPN. One book that I think you might like is Hidden Figures, based on the motion picture. If you love hearing about space and awesome accomplishments and really cool scientists, then you want to check out Hidden Figures. It is a true story about the American dream and the untold story of black women mathematicians who helped win the space race. So go to audibletrial.com/DSPN to get your free audiobook and to get a month of Audible free. I want to give a shout out to Dredd, which is an RPG where you don't have any dice. You answer a big questionnaire with all these leading questions to create your character. And then you have a Jenga tower in the middle of the table. And it's a horror game. You tell a horror story around the table. And instead of rolling dice, whenever you want to do something that has a chance of failure, you pull from the tower, just like you would in Jenga, and put the block back on top. If you knock over the tower, your character is removed from the game. Or if it happens early on in the game, your character becomes fated to be removed from the game in some way, usually through a horrible death. It's great because that mechanic sort of increases the tension of the game, and there's even a sort of heroic sacrifice mechanic where if you knock down the tower on purpose, sort of say that you're going to do it and then knock down the tower, instead of the GM choosing your fate, you get to decide how you go out, how you leave the story. So you can, take that masked scary killer with you, or heroically blow up the spaceship full of evil space zombies or whatever it is. So I really love that because you can tell all kinds of great horror stories, and the tension of the Jenga tower is very effective in building tension within the game.
Yeah, I've played Dredd, and it's fun on Free RPG Day, actually. So that's actually another way to find out about games you wouldn't know about, is go to your friendly local gaming store on Free RPG Day, and people are going to just run games for you.
That is a really, really good way to check it out. And usually, if you get there late, That way everybody's who's there is playing D&D and stuff, and then you find the really cool, weird stuff that you haven't played before. Let's talk a little bit about OSR games or the old school Renaissance. Before we get into that, just because a lot of our listeners are, familiar with D&D, Shane, could you define the old school Renaissance for me? I hate to put you on the spot like that.
I am the worst person to define that. I guess the way I think of the OSR is games that are attempting to recreate the feeling of second edition AD&D and earlier versions. So heavily D20, class focused, discrete skills, lots of math, and lots of line art. and generally the focus is going to be on dungeon crawls and those types of adventures rather than the more narrative and emotional drama that you might find in some of the games that we've talked about.
Yeah, things trying to kill you, I think, is a big part of the OSR. And when you hear people talk about they played D&D back in the day and they went through 4 characters before they ever got out of their first dungeon, I think that's sort of the feeling the OSR is trying to evoke. So I think you did a great job, by the way. So let's talk about some of our favorite old school Renaissance games that really capture that feel. Craig, let's start with you. What's one of your favorite OSR games?
I'm going to poop all over this particular topic because I have no interest in going back to 2nd edition D&D and earlier, and leave it all to you to tell me why I shouldn't play these games, or why I might be enticed to play them. Because if I was going to play the feel of those games, I would take like the dungeon crawly bits and the murder the characters kind of bits, and just use a system that I actually like. I have a hard time with OSR. I really do. Convince me, guys. Convince me of what I'm missing.
We are the wrong people for that.
Okay, well then I'm out.
I agree. This is not my favorite genre of game either, but I do think that there are games inspired by the OSR that are not as complicated, but still have that feel of like a gritty, hard dungeon crawl that is not quite as mathy. So my pick for this was going to be Maze Rats, which is a game that is super easy to find. I think it's if it's not free, it's cheap. And it's essentially a collection of random tables. Every character starts with 4 hit points, so that lets you know how hard it is. But it's very, very easy and very abstract. And my favorite part about it is the magic system. And that is because the magic system is you roll for your spells at the beginning of the day, and you roll for like an adjective and then a noun. So you might have something like enormous servant or intoxicating blob. And then you and the game master work together to decide what that spell is, how it manifests, and what it does. So that's like super fun and super open. And at the same time, it has a focus on dungeon crawls, and it is super easy to die. That'd be my pick for the OSR because it is simpler. What about you, I-Hsien? Do you have an OSR pick?
Well, I agree with the others that this isn't really my bag, quite honestly. The thing I tend to want to avoid is like meat grinder games where you're like literally crawling through the dungeon on your hands and knees and like trying to avoid random traps. So I think my pick for OSR is a game that kind of defies those stereotypes. It's called Godbound by, I think it's Sine Nomine. It's OSR, right? They describe themselves as OSR, but very specifically, you play characters who like have a spark of the divine. Like humanity has risen up and like attacked the gates of heaven and sort of like torn them down, and then like built their own gods, and then those gods have sort of like crumbled or faded, and now they're like sparks, divine sparks around that sort of manifest inside different types of people, and so it's a way to play a demigod system. But it's still based in OSR, but then you have these other abilities later on in the game that you can manifest that allow you to do sort of like crazy divine demigod type abilities that I think you tend to miss when you're playing like a level 1.5 Ratcatcher.
Yeah, I think that's a good pick. Maybe we are not the best group to discuss the OSRs, is what it sounds like, but I love that game. I think that's a really, really good, strong pick for this. What about you, Shane? Do you have any picks for the OSR?
I would throw Torchbearer out there. It's a game that is designed to be difficult and sort of test your ability as a player to navigate it, and sort of test your dungeon crawl ability, I guess. And there's lots of strategic choices that you're making about equipment, for example. Like you can't bring your 10-foot pole and your caltrops. You just won't be able to carry both. So which one are you going to pick? I guess maybe a shout out to Dungeon Crawl Classics as well, which is actually the game that I think of first when I think of OSR, and specifically the meat grinder, because you come to the table with multiple characters. Reminds me of the original Dark Sun. But both of those are games where you're going to begin as a level 1 dirt farmer. So saddle up.
Yeah, and I agree with you guys. I think it can be hard. Like I would not play through the Tomb of Horrors because I don't think it's fun to go through a dungeon tracing every wall and 5-foot square with a 10-foot pole. Right? That's just not fun for me to run. It's not fun for me to play. So I think I'm with you guys. But I think if people want to check out some stuff in the OSR, these are some pretty good suggestions to go do that. Torchbearer is a really, really interesting game, has a lot of really interesting mechanics. It's sort of good to fail in Torchbearer, which is cool. So why don't we move on to our next topic, GM-less story games. So Craig, since you sat out last round, do you have a favorite GM-less story game?
Well, I don't think we can mention this particular category without bringing up Fiasco, which may be where what we think of now as the GM-less story games began. It was designed by Jason Morningstar, and it's if you're a fan of Coen Brothers movies, it's basically that kind of movie put into game form. There's no GM. Everybody plays a character who is seeking money, sex, and power, and everything is going to go poorly. The game is designed to make things not work out well for you. If you end up exactly where you began, that's probably a success. And I've played it a few times, and that's kind of been my experience anyway, is that, like if all these terrible things happen to you and you end up, like, at most your character lost their job, you can walk away from that and clap your hands and think, all right, at least I'm not dead or in prison or, on fire in a pit. And on top of it, it's actually it's a well-designed system. It uses a whole bunch of dice, but the mechanics are pretty straightforward. It's a nicely designed book too. The graphic design of the book it's fun to read. It gets the point across with some really cool graphics that are kind of minimalist, just like 3 colors, and it's a pretty solid game.
It's also a great introduction to improv.
Yeah, and role-playing games in general.
Because you don't have a sheet to rely on.
It's also a nice way to involve a player, maybe a wallflower player who hasn't really gotten into the RP aspect of a game. Like Shane said, you can kind of trick them into being more open, because Fiasco just sort of forces you into that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is a great game to get people warmed up. How about you, Shane? Do you have a favorite GM-less game?
I also had Fiasco on my list. I will note the micro game that I wrote, Reckon is Racing, is also a GM-less story game in a similar mold. So I'll just plug myself then. I think Fiasco is a game that everybody should play, whether they like RPGs or not. I think it's just a fun family game. I've played it with my father, who could not care less about funny shaped dice. Actually couldn't care less about board games for that matter. So it was it's going to be like Whose Line Is It Anyway meets The Departed. It's going to be great. And then he understood. It was fine.
He was like, oh, I got it. I'm in.
Right.
How about you, I-Hsien? Do you have another game other than Fiasco to recommend?
I mean, who's the guy who made Fiasco? He has 9 more GM-less games.
He does.
But my favorite game with no GM is called Drinking Whiskey. It was just literally... I will say, anytime you are playing a GM-less game, you should also be playing Drinking Whiskey, because it just makes everything much more fun. But I'll give a shout out to, it's probably the other GM-less game that people know the most, Microscope.
Mm-hmm.
If Fiasco is sort of about building a crazy story about these insane characters who are doing a thing, Microscope is kind of like the opposite end of that, which is like collectively creating a world, like world building. It can even be a jumping off point to like creating a setting that you use in like a more sane system somewhere. I will say though, like as a caveat, I've never really gotten to what you might call like the quote unquote end of a Microscope game, because everything just eventually sort of devolves into like people needing to one up each other on their turn. Like, wait a minute, I have an idea that will need to be incorporated. So I highly recommend like take it easy and take your time, sip your drink while you're playing.
Yeah, that was mine and my backup that you guys mentioned.
Sorry.
No, that is fine. There are tons out there. I just Googled it and found a list of over 100 GM-less story games that I will put in the show notes. So thank you to Double Ninja's blog for that. I was going to also give a shout out to Everyone is John, which you could make the argument does kind of have a game master. The person playing John kind of is the game master. But if you have not checked out this game, you should check it out. The rules are free and on 1D4chan. It is a super quick, simple thing to play. You could probably even play it in the car or on your way to something. It's about this guy named John, and he's got a lot of voices in his head, and everybody else plays the voices. So that's pretty fun. So why don't we move on? Because I think that one sort of overlaps with the next one. Favorite micro RPG. And let's start with you, Mr. I-Hsien.
I mean, I would pick Shane's game, Reckon is Racing, but I actually I refuse to pick anything that he's ever done. I mean, I can't recommend anything Shane has ever written, and that includes our show notes. Like a solid half of them are just garbage. So, but all of our listeners know that. So, I mean, I get to start, right? So I'm just gonna go with like lasers and feelings. Like, can you get more micro than like a one-page PDF? Are you better at lasers or are you better at feelings? Done.
I agree.
Plus, it's in space, and I have a strong affinity for any RPG that takes place in space.
I'm a big Lasers and Feelings fan for the reasons that it is the simplest version of the Star Trek RPG you will ever get. How about you, Shane?
Well, I also like games that have a dichotomy on your skill set. So I'll take All Out of Bubblegum, which has two skills in it, kicking ass and otherwise. And the basic concept is that as you get hurt, you become better at kicking ass, and then eventually, and bubblegum is your measure of your ability to control yourself. And eventually, when you're all out of bubblegum, you have nothing else you can do but kick ass. And that's the game. Is as a GM, you're basically trying to wear down your players until they're eventually stuck in a situation where they have to fight their way out. And it's just very open-ended. I've played so it was basically Smokey and the Bandit with like fairy bootleggers. And yeah, whatever. All Out of Bubblegum got it done just fine.
How about you, Craig? What's one of your favorite micro RPGs?
There's a game out there called Dr. Magnet Hands, and it's about an evil genius named Dr. Magnet Hands, and you set out to defeat him. It barely qualifies as a game. I mean, it's essentially and that's a good thing. I mean that in the best possible way. It's essentially a structure for telling a ridiculous story. So everybody takes a piece of paper and a pencil, and you write down a bunch of weird character names and identities, like superhero style, some strange superpowers and bizarre props and plot devices, and then you tear those pieces up and you throw them all in a hat, and everybody draws a handful out, and you start using those to develop your story. And there's a little rundown of like kind of how you do it, but it's like just a couple paragraphs long. I don't remember the guy who wrote it. He's a British guy, and it shows in the writing. He strongly recommends that you play it drunk. That you get drunk before you play the game, and then
wait, what game is this again?
Dr. Magnet Hands.
All right, I mean,
what is the Yeah. What is the defining feature of the bad guy? His hands are magnets. That's the only thing that doesn't change from game to game.
I mean, he's also a doctor. Wait, is he a medical doctor or a PhD?
That could change. We don't know. You'd have to determine that as you play.
No, I think he's like Dr. J.
That's awesome.
So you can find it. It's not like in any normal place. It's like this guy. He writes games and it's just kind of tucked away. But if you look up Dr. Magnet Hands RPG, you'll focus in and find it. It's a free PDF. It's like 2 pages long. It's a funny read too, actually.
Well, I'm going to go with Jim Mcclure's The Terrible RPG, which is an RPG where you have 5 skills and you write them down on a piece of paper. And then to use your skills, you have to tear off a letter of that skill successfully. And then once you run out of letters to tear, you can no longer use that skill. There's a couple rules about how specifically you're allowed to tear and that sort of thing. And so it's really fun as you get into it because you can see people trying to tear off just one letter. And sometimes, they're tearing off 2 and it's devastating. And so it's really fun. And it's any 5 skills you can think of, everything from summon Cthulhu to eat with a spoon and anything in between that you can think of. So it's a really fun, wild, bonkers role-playing game. So that is my pick, Jim Mcclure's The Terrible RPG from Third Act Publishing. Check that out.
Wait, so are you just trying to pick skills that have as many letters as possible?
No, I think there's a rule that says that if you try and do that, you're missing the point.
So I win. I win. Basically, is what you mean.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's, the game is very encouraging of like, you're going to play this once with this character, so don't try to be too precious with anything. It's all about telling the story, like most micro RPGs, right? There's not a ton of focus on anything other than the bonkersness of it all, except for Reckon is Racing, a very serious micro RPG where it's all about winning.
That is definitely not true, but I will say there is one micro RPG and exactly one micro RPG that I can think of that isn't a joke, and that's The Bite by Dan Enders. The tension comes from there are 2 characters, right? It's meant to be played with 2 players, also GM-less, so I missed that in that category. But you don't know until the very last scene which one of them has been bitten by a zombie, and so it's about their final moments.
That's really cool. Oh, you know what? Another Jim Mcclure game that's GM-less that I should have mentioned is Reflections, his game where you are 2 best friends who have ended up in a fatal duel together, and you sort of go back through these big moments in your life before the duel, and then one of you kills the other one. So that is a really, really great game. I think I was trying to think of GM-less games for more than 2 people, but yeah, I really, really like Reflections. All right, well, I want to wrap this up with a quick question for all of you guys. We know the consumer base for all of these games is incredibly small. $35 million in 2015, according to the ICV2 hobby report in the US and Canada for role-playing games for the whole year, which is incredibly small. Do you think that having a lot of diversification in the industry with all of these games is helpful to the hobby, or do you think it hurts the hobby? And if so, why? And Craig, let's start with you.
There's something to be said for a consumer realm where there's, strong competition. What we're in right now, these quote-unquote Renaissance golden age of games, with the availability of Kickstarter and people being able to put their stuff online and creating digital versions of their games rather than having to get things printed, and the ease with which you can find illustrators and layout people and editors and so forth, has built this game community and the game design community significantly lately. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, it can only serve to give the diversity to the marketplace that people are, maybe looking for. There's a lot of people out there who Like, well, I'm not really necessarily into, a lot of these types of games, but, if there's a game where you can battle aliens and giant ants like you're in a 1950s sci-fi movie, there's a game for that, and it's called This Defiant Earth, and it's going to be coming out very soon. If you can think of it, you can find the game, and there's some amount of audience for it, and it allows little people like me and all sorts of other people out there that just would like to make a game and put it in people's hands to put it out there. I think it's a healthy thing. I don't think Paizo or Wizards or any of the other big houses are really suffering significantly, because they're still going to get bought by gamers in general, like a lot of gamers. All the smaller houses are getting enough exposure that the authors are thinking, okay, well, cool, I'm reaching some people.
Well, and let me ask you this, Craig, right? You said you're not playing a ton of D&D these days. Do you have the D&D 5th edition core rulebooks?
Sure. Yeah, I have a lot of books I don't play.
like many of us, I assume. Shane, what do you think? Do you think a rising tide lifts all ships? Is that metaphor even appropriate here?
Yeah, I think that's fine. So I struggle because overall it's a good thing, right? Because RPGs are competing with all forms of entertainment. So if you spend $25 on an RPG book, that's $25 you could have spent on a board game or a video game or going to the movies, right? So the fact that there is a product to fill not every niche, but, just about everything you could want to do in a role-playing game, that there's something for you there and some way to spend money on it, that's ultimately good. I think the problem is that the market isn't growing to the point, like, that it's sustainable for most creators, right? Like, most game designers aren't full-time game designers, and if they are, they're probably not full-time game designers on role-playing games. And so that's kind of what sucks about it, is just that the nature of the product and the nature of the industry and just the size of the market is just not enough that people like Craig, who put out really cool games about how I want to kill my coworkers, like, can't do that full time, right? Because I would love to know what his next idea is, and it's going to be probably a couple years before we find that out, because he's got to kickstart it instead of and go to a real job instead of just doing that.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. And I think there's multiple causes for that. I think part of it could be the thieving of games as well, that people feel like all RPGs should be free. I think is not everybody thinks that, right? But enough people think that I think it has an impact. But also, there's just not a lot of people playing RPGs in general. So there's plenty of people stealing music, and we've got lots of full-time musicians. So yeah, I would like to see more full-time game designers for sure. How about you, I-Hsien? What do you think about our little market that has many, many products in it?
I mean, I'd like to give a shout out to maybe increasing the amount of leave time Americans get, because our work-life balance sucks, which makes it harder to play games.
and also harder to write them and
true.
publish them and work on our podcast.
Right. Oh, it's not.
If you love it, right? You never work a day in your life.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. You work every single day, every moment. Yeah, practically speaking, I think having so many games out there in the short term probably does make it harder for like a new person to break into this industry, and for people who are really just trying to hit that break point where like it sort of like was worth it in a practical sense, as opposed to just like feeling good about yourself for having created something. But obviously, I think in the long term, I agree with like everyone else saying it is a good thing for the industry, because like the reason we have D&D talked about on Stranger Things is that like 25 years ago, like some nerd was in a basement and like they made good, like eventually, And so the more that we diversify the appeal of RPGs now, the better the positioning is going to be in the decades to come.
I think that we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence. It seems like more people are trying RPGs, which I think is great. And it's great that we have the gateway drugs of Dungeons and Dragons and Paizo out there so that more people can find these other awesome games that people are working on. You know, Craig, because you were on this podcast, I feel like we didn't mention Murders and Acquisitions, but it is a super, super fun game that people should check out. I played it with my friends this past weekend, and they could not get enough. I was a little worried because then it was like, let's go see the Belko experiment. But, you know, that's them stealing. Hollywood stole your idea. It was crazy.
No, I have tried really hard to put this game in the hands of James Gunn, and I have not been able to make contact with him yet. I'm still trying. He's the writer of the Belko experiment.
Have you considered serving him? Like, just sue him for anything, because you can, because America. But just include the game.
There you go. There you go. I think maybe you guys should give James Gunn a Thrilly. And then when he accepts his Thrilly, you could give him a copy of Murders and Acquisitions.
Everyone accepts it. It's true.
First of all, nobody accepts their Thrilly.
Or acknowledges.
Or acknowledges they exist.
Well, are you up for best micro RPG? Maybe you could be the first person to accept a Thrilly.
I'd like to accept this award from myself, and I'd like to thank myself for making
exactly.
it.
So, in all serious note, James, if I can propose a straw man and then eviscerate it, one thing that sometimes you hear is people talking about the diversity of games that are available and why that's bad is about how difficult it is to find games. And it's always new players, right? So like how could a new player get into this hobby? There's so many things out there. Where would you start, right? And I think I call that a straw man because I feel like the vast majority of people either start with D&D, Pathfinder, or one of the handful of like licensed games, right? Like Star Wars, right? I gotta be honest, I doubt there's anybody who's gonna pick up Phoenix Dawn Command as their first game and say, hey, I play role-playing games now, you know? Maybe Fiasco if they're at a bookstore or something, but they're not picking up like Dungeon Crawl Classics or something. So the majority of people come into the hobby through like a very limited number of games. And so I think in some ways it's incumbent upon those designers and those publishers to make sure that people are finding other things after their products, because, you know, Wizards of the Coast would love to sell like 90% of the games in a smaller market rather than half of the games in a very big market, if that's more money in their pocket. And that's just like kind of that sad nature of a small hobby.
Sure. I think that makes sense. And I think that argument too, I always point to craft beer. Like, there are so many craft beers and you never hear a white dude say like, I don't think I'm going to get into craft beer because I don't know where to start. You know what I mean? Every white dude in America is into craft beer.
To be fair, if you had to read a rule book on beer before you were allowed to crack it open.
There's just one more quick point that I want to add is that with a diversity of game designers, you end up with a diversity of viewpoints and opinions and like cultural viewpoints. And I think that makes the entire industry and like gaming itself more accessible to different kinds of people who weren't usually there, right? You have games designed by women. You have games that are not necessarily created from a Eurocentric standpoint. You know, not everyone grew up watching like, you know, the Lord of the Rings. Or, you know, if your like touchstone with fantasy is Akira, it's good that there are other games that bring in those types of viewpoints and allow you to play the stories that you are seeing in your head and not feel like you're quote unquote breaking the rules.
Yeah, well, and it's a good point because, you know, I finally got my wife to play D&D, I guess, about a year ago, and we sat down to make her character. She wanted to make an elf ranger, and she was like, ooh, I'm going to Google female elf ranger and see what comes up. And I was like,
don't do that.
This is where it ends. This is it. This is the end of our short time playing RPGs together. And luckily it wasn't, but like, exactly what you thought came up, right, in that Google image search. So I do think it's good to get more viewpoints in gaming, and then it's good for us, you know, people who maybe only have one viewpoint in life to play some other games, because that's why we play role-playing games, right? Is to experience other points of view and to escape and to kill some orcs. So it's great to see how other people go about killing orcs, metaphorically. Cool. Well, I think that is going to do it for this podcast, guys. Before we go, let's go around the table and let people know where they can find you. Craig Campbell, where can people find you?
You can listen to me and a friend of mine talk about all sorts of geeky stuff with a lot of humor at NerdBurgerShow.com. 4 years going strong. You can buy my game, Murders and Acquisitions, at DriveThruRPG.com, and you can learn more about game stuff that's going on with me, like some people on this podcast were wondering about, at NerdBurgerGames.com, where you can also download a microgame I designed called You Suck at Making Sandwiches. And it's about making sandwiches and how you suck at it. So there you go.
And Shane, where can people find you?
I am on Twitter at Mundangerous. That's MUN Dangerous. And I am on the Total Party Thrill podcast on iTunes or at TotalPartyThrillCast.com.
Excellent. And where can people find you, I-Hsien?
I am on Twitter at Evil Sans Carne. That's malice minus meat. Also on the Total Party Thrill podcast. You can also reach us at totalpartythrill@gmail.com, and we're on Facebook and Instagram at Total Party Thrill.
Excellent. And hopefully soon you guys will release some of those Foretold DMs Guild products I've been hearing about. So
I mean, as soon as we fix the Family and Medical Leave Act, then I've got time.
Oh, man. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble today. I really appreciate all of your time and recommendations.
Thanks for having us, James.
Thank you, sir.
Wow, that is awesome. I have a ton of new games that I'm going to need to check out after that podcast. You know, Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and the best way to help people learn about us is to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Seriously, the more people who listen to the show, the longer I will probably do it. So go leave us a 5-star review to help other people find us. And you know what? If you don't have an iTunes account, it's super easy and super quick to make one, and you can leave a 5-star review for this show, and then you can go leave a 5-star review for all the other podcasts you love. You'll be putting good things into the community. That's a great, great thing that you can do. As a bonus, I read one new 5-star review verbatim every episode and credit the person who left it. Make me say anything you want. Today's review comes from the one and only Rich Green 01. He is in the United Kingdom, and his review is entitled Episode 5, Must Listen. Rich Green 01 says, there have been some good interviews on the podcast, but Episode 5 is definitely a must-listen for anyone interested in freelance work or self-publishing in the RPG industry. That was a great episode, one of my favorites we've done so far, with Teos Abadia and Rob Schwalb talking about the biz. We gotta get those guys back. That was pretty awesome. And if you want to support the show financially, there's a way to do that costs you nothing extra. Just go to don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, click on the banners on the left of the website for Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG.com. Go there before you shop. It will cost you nothing extra, but throws a few pennies on the dollar our way to help pay for the costs of the podcast. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network, thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Remember that RPGs are like sex. As long as everybody's having fun, you're doing it right.